Hi guys. So if you don't already know me, I'm Jeannie Heil. I'm a professor that specializes in second language acquisition at USM, and today is our first session of L2 for Seminar in Syntax, the WH semester. Here in front of you see the beginning of my presentation. You will find these slides accompanying these video segments. Also send me questions as they come up. I put in the slide numbers, so take note of that if you have specific questions. If you find that anything that I say is different or conflicting with what you've seen previously in the course, because there are multiple models for things, do feel free to reach out to me and or Dana to resolve those sort of inequivalencies. However, I believe that you should be fine. So let's begin. WH is second language acquisition. So, first of all, what is second language acquisition? And how does it differ from first language acquisition? This is probably an obvious question, but we should still ask it, right? So in second language acquisition, the learner already has language in their mind. So second language acquisition is a process that undergoes transfer. Transfer where you take knowledge from one language and move it into another. Second language acquisition is a type of acquisition in which context is very different. So whereas a child typically learns their first language, naturalistic settings, people speaking to them, probably at home. A second language learner typically is learning a language in a classroom. Not always, but typically. And finally, second language learners, being typically adult learners, are already having their language either way, are more aware of what's happening as they're learning. So that learning process itself, they're either going, oh, I haven't learned this, or oh, I've never heard that, or maybe I'll focus on this, which means a second language acquisition is an explicit process many times as opposed to an implicit one. Now, there are ways to push it back into the realm of implicit, but that's a topic for Linguistics 317. Now, there are two major types of second language theories, and I'm going to show them to you, but we're going to focus on only one of them. One of them is property theories, aka what you know. So, have you learned adjectives in French, for example? That would a theory that explains what you know, having adjectives or not having adjectives, that's a property theory. The other kind are transition theories, which is about how you come to know what you know. So let's imagine that I have learned adjectives in French. The question is, how did that come about? Was that transferred from my Italian first language? Or did I come from English? And the adjective properties of English are very different. So I've either learned them through enough input, or someone taught it to me, or. These are all transition theories. The various factors we saw on the previous page, generally speaking, pertain to transition theories. Transfer results in properties, but the actual process of transfer is transition, amazingly, from the roots. But like explicit versus implicit and context, these are all about transition theories. And WH in our seminar in syntax is much more a property-laden question. So here, when we investigate knowledge of WH in learners' minds, we are focusing on property theories. Okay, what is it that we know? Not necessarily how we got there, but there are accompanying theories for that. Now, principles and parameters. Some of you have heard this term more recently than others, and they have to do with what we believe exists in universal grammar. Now, languages share some commonalities, such as the existence of different types of WH questions. There are no languages, human languages, that lack WH questions. That's just a given, right? And so these kinds of things that are givens and common across all languages are called principles. And principles are the unchanging pieces under the hood. Like the anaphor principle is a principle, if you couldn't tell by the name. Now, of course, languages have variation, which you've seen some of already in this semester. These variation usually is from a set of options. We saw some specific ones to WH movement this semester, things like movement versus non-movement, but even word order, like canonical word order, like subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb. These are from among options. And we call this parameters because it's usually this option or that option. And it's called parametric variation, whether you have this parameter or that parameter. Now, so when we are acquiring a language with a typological difference from our own language, we are acquiring or resetting our parameters. English and Japanese is our test case for this week, and English and Japanese are parametrically different in several respects. Let's look at a test sentence. Here's the version in English. What did John eat? This is a matrix question. It's an object question. It's very simple. This is what it looks like in Japanese, and here is its gloss. It's pronounced something like "Jon ga nani o tabemashita ka?" Right? Something like that. And you'll see that John is our subject. The particle ga is saying, I'm a subject, because Japanese marks those types of roles with particles. Nani means what, and o is I'm an object. Tabemashita is tabemaru marked in the past tense, so ate. And ga, this lovely little q, is a question particle. Because some languages, like Japanese, go, I'm a question. Because otherwise it would be ambiguous because of word ordered questions and so forth. But at least in these languages, depending on whether you're formal or informal, not having that ka doesn't allow it to be a question. Now, we can surmise from this that if this is more or less in canonical word order, we already know English is subject, verb, object, right? John ate the cake. And Japanese, if you don't already know, is SOV, as in John the cake ate. So if we know that, what else can we determine about the parametric distinctions, the differences between English and Japanese here? Well, we'll notice that the what is not in the periphery in number 2. It's right smack dab in the middle, and if you're paying attention to the word order, that's in C2. So whereas English is going to have WH movement, and linearly it looks like it's left, but that has to do with head ordering. Japanese has WH and C2. It's exactly where it would be if it was a declarative sentence. And it also happens to be the case that Japanese has a question particle, but we're not going to worry about that right now. It is different. But just, you can kind of say, that's interesting and set it aside. What we're going to talk about today has to do with in C2 versus movement. Okay, so acquiring typological differences. How do we acquire a parameter setting? That is, how do I go from WH and C2 to WH movement? Well, if those things are, well, before my example, if I go from a WH movement language to a WH movement language, we can just transfer that, right? So if I go from English to German and I say I have WH movement, now I have WH movement, that's a transfer. It's very easy, right? It's not really even acquired practically. But if, as I said in Japanese, they're different, we do have to acquire them. So somehow I have to go from in C2 to movement. Now, recall, this is definition officially when you're back studying this later. Transfer is the application of information from one language to another, usually parameter settings or features. And we'll get back to features in a second. But it's using language information from your L1 and your L2 in this case. So many times we do transfer our parameter settings at the initial state, so when I start learning my second language, even though those settings can be incorrect. So if I were producing English WH and C2 at the initial state of L1 Japanese, I might say, John saw what? Like an echo question, except for that would be my only way to ask that, versus the target, what did John see? A minor detail, so I said we come back to features. So this is one of those cases where your model of how this occurs can differ, because there's a couple different theories. For the discussion we're about to have, it matters that movement happens due to feature strength under this version of universal grammar. So a common analysis for movement is that strong uninterpretable features trigger movement. This has to do with features on T. So when the subject raises up, that's supposed to be due to a strong feature. It's the same idea in WH movement, a strong feature. In the case WH, this is and this is my little symbol here. If you're gonna, we'll come back to the end. So this isn't vital to understanding today's lesson, but this is what's here. The star means strong. The little italicized U means uninterpretable, which simply means it doesn't have lexical content. You know, it's not like the need for C to have a WH in it is due to some kind of fun extra word. It just does. It's a question. It needs that, right? It's uninterpretable. And it has to be satisfied by something interpretable, like a WH word, right? We need a who or a what or a when or a where or a how or something. So strong, uninterpretable WH. So strong means movement. And as you might imagine, the prediction under this analysis is that Japanese's WH isn't strong, so it doesn't trigger movement. So you can see how that would be essentially a parametric difference. And how would you acquire the parametric difference? You'd have to acquire a strong WH feature. Yeah? So here we can say, so as a result, when we talk about resetting parameters going from L1 Japanese to L2 English, we can analyze this as acquiring a strong uninterpretable WH. So this is here so that when you study it later, you go, oh yeah. Okay. So resetting parameters. My question, and this is a fundamental one to this discussion, is it the case that learning to move a WH, or aka acquiring a strong WH feature, is like flipping a switch? Does everything come along with it? Because it's assumed that if we truly have WH movement, we have to obey subjacency, right? We can't have island violations, right? It also means that if we have movement, then we should have obey superiority. Superiority is also called attract closest, and we'll get back to this in a second. You have talked about islands, I think. So the proposal would be, if we have it acquired in all of its senses, completely, fully, and beautifully, and totally strong WH like English, that you should get restrictions on subjacency violations. You should want to obey superiority. These things should come along for the ride, right? Okay, we're going to actually test this. Ready? So attract closest was the second one. It's also called superiority. I'm generally going to call it attract closest because it's sort of a transparent name as opposed to superiority. Could mean a lot of things. But I often will write both in the text because when you read it in articles, you may see superiority as opposed to attract closest. Anyway, Radford 2004 is usually who gets cited when we talk about this. He writes it this way: a head which attracts a given type of constituent attracts the closest constituent of the relevant kind. Okay, how about we make this more relevant to WH and easier to read? So in other words, if there are multiple WH words in an utterance, the one that's closest to the attracting head, so here a C with a strong WH feature, will move, and never the other one. So if I have two WH, the one's closer to C is always the subject. So if you have two WH, the subject's going to move, and never the object. Okay? So this is superiority, and you attract what's closest. It doesn't apply in the same way to adjuncts, but it does apply to arguments. Now, let's see this in action. Here I have two sentences, 4 and 5. John bought a newspaper. The professor said the students studied in the library over the weekend. So what I want you to do, pause it and scribble. For each sentence, I want you to turn the underlined constituents into WH words and form a grammatical WH question. Go ahead. I'll wait. Yeah? I'm assuming you paused. It takes longer to write than that. Okay, so let's start with 4. John bought a newspaper. Now here I'm going to use the little primes, which are like little apostrophes, to indicate new versions and relationships. So these are all kind of under the umbrella of 4. So John bought a newspaper. The normal question for this is who bought what, right? So if John becomes who and newspaper becomes what, the subject is closer to C, so you're going to keep the subject up by C. This isn't particularly easy to see movement because it's the subject, and the subject doesn't trigger do support, but you'll see the order is maintained, who bought what. But it's not about a linear order, it is about hierarchical proximity. Okay, and here's my notes for when you're studying later. The subject John is higher than the object, thus the subject raises to the spec C. Okay, it satisfies that strong uninterpretable WH feature. The object has nowhere to raise to, so it hangs out where it was. Okay. Now, back to the other one. The professor said the students studied in the library over the weekend. So in the library becomes where, over the weekend becomes when. Now these are both adjuncts, so which one gets pulled up is less extremely important. However, there are restrictions on movement here. Now, the target version of the question is typically this one. Where did the professor say the students studied when? Right? And I have left a trace, not in the initial position, because we can do that too in a second if we wanted. But I've left the trace in a place that it had to go through, where the where had to pass through in order to get out of the embedded clause. This is cyclic movement. We cannot escape the lower clause without passing through C, well, spec of C, of the embedded clause. So we leave a trace in that position because in order to get out into the matrix clause, we have to make our way through that position. We have to move cyclically. We can't just go in one big motion. It's too far. We have to pass through spec of CP. Okay, that's the trace that you see in my 5' right here. Okay, so the important part, however, is that C of the embedded clause already attracted where? It already went, so it can't also attract when. That's kind of important, actually. And in fact, if it looks like it did, it doesn't maintain its meaning. So if I take 5" here, and I've tried to attract the other WH into spec of C of the lower clause, I end up with, where did the professor say when the students studied? And you might say to me, that sounds like an okay question. I would say, but what does it mean? Because with these traces, where they're both at the bottom, it doesn't mean that, right? The meaning of 5" is not, where did the professor say the students studied when? It is about, where was the professor when he said the students studied, right? Or when he was talking about when they studied. The meaning you're supposed to get, judging by the traces, is the professor said the students studied where or when, right? So we're talking about scope here. The original meaning is supposed to be where has scope in the matrix clause. I'm sorry, in the embedded clause, where the thing that we're talking about is where they studied. And the only way that a sentence that sounds like 5" could possibly work, our question, is if the interpretation changes, right? So if instead of where having scope in the embedded clause, if now it has scope in the matrix clause, which we can only see by traces, you don't hear it, right? Then it can be okay. Now compare the traces in 5" to 5" triple prime. Notice that the trace of where in 5" is in the embedded clause. The trace of where in 5" is in the matrix clause. So in 5" if where refers to the place where the professor said something, this question's fine because attract closest is always, your C is always going down. So the matrix C found where, and the embedded C then subsequently found when, right? It's attracting the closest thing. The problem with 5" is that for where to move through spec C of the embedded clause, it's suddenly that embedded clause can also attract when. So if where has scope of the matrix clause, this is completely fine. That's 5" Where was he saying it? But if we try to do 5" where did they study? It does not work. Okay? Yes?